Hello, today we'll be talking about navigation in Android using Kotlin and Jetpack Compose. This is different and much easier than navigation using XML and the nav graph. I assume that you all know how to build a UI using Jetpack Compose. If you don't, you can still follow along with this video, but you'll find it hard to build a UI once you get to the navigation target. As usual, I'll start with an overview of the structure of what we're trying to learn. If you don't like the theoretical stuff and you want to just look at code, I'll put a bookmark on the video timeline and you can skip directly to the code example. The code for this tutorial will be found on GitHub and I'll put a link in the description below. The structure of navigation. Like all things in Android, you have to add a dependency to the Gradle. Second thing you have to take care of is a mapping between routes, which are like URLs or names of places you want to go, and locations or targets you want to arrive at, which will be composables. And you have to flesh out the composables. Composables which aren't final targets also have to have a command for the continued navigation. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is to set up the dependency. The dependency has to be added to the app level Gradle. This is a dependency and it will be written in the description below. I encourage you to Google it and check if there's a newer version when you come to implement your navigation. Route mapping. In order to create the route mapping, we have to create a nav controller. Using the nav controller, we create a nav host. And in the nav host, we define two things. One of them is the route composable mapping or pairs. Every route will point at one composable, which we will arrive at using the route, which is just a string. And the second thing defined in the nav host is the first target, so we know where to start our navigation. Creating the targets. Every target has to be implemented as a composable, and every target which isn't a final target, that being one you want to navigate away from, has to contain a command to navigate away from it, and therefore it has to receive the nav controller as a parameter. This command to navigate away will use the route as we defined it in the nav host. Adding parameters to the call to the targets is just a technical issue and will be explained in the code. So here we are in the code. Let's look at what we did to implement the navigation. As we said, the first thing we have to do is add a dependency. So this is the dependency we added. Then let's have a look at the main activity. In main activity, the only addition to the code created by Android Studio is a call to this composable which I defined. You can call it whatever you like. App navigation, starting point, my app is running here, or whatever you like. Let's go and see how it is implemented. So this is the starting point of our navigation, which is also the beginning of this very small app. We create the nav controller and get a reference to it by calling remember nav controller. Then we create a nav host by passing the nav controller as the first parameter into the nav host. In a moment we'll talk about the second parameter here, but first I want to talk about what we find in the trailing lambda. In the trailing lambda we find composables which have a string in them which we call the route. That's like a URL or an address to call to get to this composable, and each one of them has a trailing lambda with something to execute. So these are the pairs I was talking about of route, executable. This is a different route, and this is what will be executed when that route is called. Now let's go back to this second parameter. All this is telling the nav host where to start. So once we have all the routes with their destinations defined, we can say, hey look, nav host, I want to start at inputs. So when the nav host is called, the first place it will go to is inputs and run this lambda. Now all this lambda does is actually call this function, which we call inputs, which is another composable. As we see, we also pass the nav controller to inputs because this is not a final destination. We're going to navigate away from this screen. There's a bit of UI stuff here going on to place a button in the middle. It will say go to next page. The main thing to look at here is this line here, which will be executed on click. So when this button is clicked, it will result in calling this lambda function. This lambda function will call the nav controller as passed into the inputs function, ask it to navigate to the address called outputs. That will result in a call to this lambda function, which will call outputs and pass the parameter JR into it. So JR will fall on the name here, and all this does is display it to a text in the middle of the screen. Now let's see how this works. We get a button, it says go to next page. We hit on it and it says hello JR. One thing to note is that one of the responsibilities of the navigation system is to remember where we are and pop back once we've been there. So when we hit on click here and we navigate away to outputs and call this, the navigation system, the nav controller, remembers where we've been, and if we hit back, we can go back. Let's see that in action. So go to next page, hello JR. There is no navigation defined here, as you remember, looking at the code. It doesn't even get the nav controller, but hitting the back button, we get back to the first screen. And that is what the navigation system does for you, so you don't have to do it. So I checked out the other branch, which also demonstrates how to pass parameters between the different parts of the project. As before, we define a nav controller. Using the nav controller, we define a nav host and also tell the nav host where is the first route to start from. That would be the inputs. Just to see how the parameters are going to be passed, let's look how outputs receives parameters, and after that we'll go into inputs and see how this is constructed. Well, it's still called outputs, but following the outputs it has a series of slashes and curly brackets with names of arguments in them. You can call them whatever you like, but just for the sake of it I called them args1 and args2. Following that, still within the composable, we defined what these arguments are. So previously we had only one parameter, like up here in input, which was the root. But now we have the root, the definition of the names of the arguments, and following that we have a second parameter called arguments, which is a list of all the arguments with everyone having its properties. So we define them by nav argument, the name of the argument, and within a trailing lambda we say the type is of nav type int type. That's what I'm using. And is it nullable? No, it's not nullable. And another argument with name arg2 of what type, nav type, int type. There are many different types. You can look into it and see. You have Boolean array type and float type and whatever you need type, but I was using an int type. Once the composable gets the full root, including the arguments, we'll just have numbers written here. It, in the trailing lambda, passes this input and takes out of it the values. So we say A1 is equal to args, that's the lambda variable that we use, dot arguments get int. What int do we want? The one called arg1. It's called arg1 because we defined the name up here. And in A2 we again refer back to args, which we get as the lambda variable dot arguments get int. Which one? This time we want arg2, and then once we have the data we pass it into output. Before going to output and seeing how the data is used, let's go into input and see how this full root is constructed. So here we are in inputs. We know we're going to have two arguments, argument 1 and argument 2. In both cases we have to use by remember, so we're persistent, and it's in immutable state of, and we give a default value of 0. We'll ignore all the UI stuff and jump directly into where we get the argument. We get it from a text field. Every time the text field is changed on value change, we go to the lambda variable and convert it into an int and put it into the argument 1. Same is done for argument 2 down here. When a button is pressed on click, we navigate using the nav controller, navigate, and then we pass into outputs, and using string interpolation here we put arg1 and arg2 into the string and send that back up to the navigation. So once we construct a string here, call the navigation on the nav controller, which was passed to inputs all the way up here, we're actually calling outputs because we get a root which fits exactly here. It's called outputs with arguments. We've explained how they're taken out of the string here and put into variables, and these variables are just placed into the correct places in the output function, and output is called. Again, ignoring all the layout stuff, all that we've done here is we set the output text to be the value of arg1 times arg2 is equal to answer, which we define up here. So that's all that's done in this part of the project. Now let's have a look at it. So we have two text fields and a button. We press 5 here, 234 here. Let's get rid of the keyboard. We hit answer and we see the arguments have passed. 5 times 234 must be equals to 1170. And we can hit back and enter something else. 5 times 6 equals 30. So that's all there is to pass in arguments. I hope this video was useful. If you found it useful, please like it, consider subscribing, leaving a comment down below. If you didn't like it, please leave a nice comment down below so I know what to improve for next time. As I said, all the code will be linked through the GitHub links in the description below, and also the dependency will be written below. Thank you and goodbye.